On the 23rd of April 1014, two opposing armies took their positions along the Irish coast, bracing for what would become one of the most consequential clashes in medieval history. On one side stood a Norse-Leinster coalition of fighters. On the other, a Gaelic-Irish force marching under the banner of their High King, Brian Boru. To understand what brought these armies to the fields of Clontarf, one must look back at the fragile and fractious political world of early medieval Ireland. At the turn of the 11th century, Ireland was not a unified nation, but rather a mosaic of competing kingdoms. Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and Ulster, each governed independently by its own ruler. Towering above them all, at least in theory, was the office of High King. Yet in practice, this title carried no guaranteed authority. Power was only as real as one's ability to enforce it through military strength, and the island had long been accustomed to shifting loyalties and broken allegiances. Adding another layer of complexity was the enduring presence of the Norse. Generations of Viking incursions had left a permanent mark on the Irish landscape. Settlements at Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford had evolved far beyond simple raiding camps. By this period, they were flourishing commercial centers. Wealthy, well-fortified, and deeply embedded in the political fabric of the island. These Norse towns were not outsiders operating at the margins. They were active players in Irish power politics, forming alliances, brokering deals, and accumulating influence that rivaled that of native Irish kings. It was within this tangled environment that Brian Boru rose to prominence. Through military victories and strategic maneuvering, Brian defeated the Norse rulers of Limerick, brought rival Irish kingdoms to heel, and steadily expanded his authority far beyond the borders of his home province of Munster. By the year 1002, he had compelled the reigning High King, Mael Mórda, to yield an act that effectively handed Brian a level of centralized control that Ireland had seldom, if ever, experienced. He was, for a time, the closest thing the island had to a single unifying authority. Brian Boru's supremacy did not go unchallenged. The stronger his grip became, the more resentment smoldered beneath the surface. Particularly in Leinster, whose king, Mael Mórda, had long bristled under Brian's dominance. Years of strained relations between the two rulers eventually gave way to open defiance. Leinster broke from Brian's authority and openly declared its challenge to his rule, setting in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the bloodshed at Clontarf. Seeking to strengthen his hand, Mael Mórda turned to Dublin and its Norse king, Sigurd Silkbeard, as his primary ally. Dublin was no ordinary Viking outpost. It was a thriving maritime hub, deeply connected to the wider Norse world, and capable of summoning fighters from across the Irish Sea. Sigurd understood the stakes clearly. Brian's continued dominance posed a direct threat to Dublin's independence, and the Norse king had every reason to support the rebellion. Messengers were dispatched across the water. From the Isle of Man came Sigurd the Stout, bringing a contingent of battle-hardened Norse warriors with him. The coalition that assembled against Brian was therefore not merely a domestic Irish uprising. It was an international alliance of Viking settlers and seasoned raiders, estimated at roughly 7,000 fighters in total. A formidable and diverse force united by a shared interest in breaking Brian's authority once and for all. Brian, now an elderly man likely in his mid to late 70s, began mobilizing his own forces in the early weeks of 1014. His son and grandson fought at his side as he drew in men from Munster and gathered allies from Connacht and Meath. Notably, the former High King Mael Mórda, the man Brian had once displaced, returned to fight alongside him, recognizing that the threat posed by the coalition outweighed past grievances. The Gaelic-Irish army that marched toward Dublin numbered approximately 5,000 men. They advanced to meet their enemies on the coastal plain, lying just to the north of the city, at a location known as Clontarf. It is worth pausing to note that Sigurd Silkbeard himself did not take to the battlefield. The Norse king of Dublin remained within the city walls, alongside sufficient men to hold it in the event of a defeat. He reportedly observed the unfolding battle from the ramparts alongside his wife slain, who happened to be Brian's own daughter, a detail that speaks to how deeply the Norse and Irish worlds had become intertwined by this point in history. Contemporary accounts suggest that neither army entered the engagement with anything resembling a coordinated tactical strategy. This was not to be a battle of careful maneuver or calculated positioning. It would instead be a brutal contest of endurance, a war of attrition fought at close quarters by men who refused to yield easily. Once the two forces had drawn close enough to one another, the fighting erupted with immediate and overwhelming ferocity. Javelins and spears were hurled across the narrowing gap. Arrows filled the air. Then the lines collided. Overall command of the Norse-Leinster vanguard rested with a commander named Brodir, while Brian's son Merchad MacBrian led the Gaelic-Irish front lines. Neither side approached the other with particular caution. Both forces surged directly forward, The Norse-Leinster alliance held certain material advantages going into the clash. Their ships were anchored nearby, providing a potential line of retreat, and the fortified city of Dublin stood behind them, a psychological backstop that likely bolstered confidence in their ranks. One of the most significant tactical distinctions between the two armies was the matter of armor. A substantial portion of the Norse-Leinster force wore chainmail, granting them meaningful protection against enemy weapons. By contrast, the majority of Brian's Gaelic Irish warriors fought without heavy armor, with only a small number equipped with any mail protection. On the surface, this placed the Irish at a disadvantage in terms of physical vulnerability. However, the absence of heavy armor brought its own benefit. The Irish fighters moved with considerably more speed and agility. As the fighting wore on relentlessly through hours of hand-to-hand combat, this proved crucial. The weight of chainmail became an increasing burden on the Norse-Leinster fighters, sapping their stamina at a far greater rate than their lighter-clad opponents. The battle raged without pause. Medieval sources would later describe it as among the most savage and destructive engagements of the entire Middle Ages. Men fell in vast numbers, the wounded crying out beneath the press of bodies, the dead accumulating across the coastal plain. Amid this carnage, the old chronicler